Okay, moving on to our final speaker for the session, I'd like to introduce Holly Cooke to the stage. Holly recently completed her honours degree at the University of Adelaide on the human geology of mine waste and the critical minerals contained within. Holly completed her honours while working for initially Oz Minerals, now BHP, and continues to be an engaged geoscience storyteller who encourages people-planet connection and Earth stewardship in the resource industry. Welcome, Holly.
Hello, thank you Discovery Day for inviting me to come along. This research that I want to present today is, as Mitch mentioned, it's formed my honours project this year. And of course I've been really well supported by my team at Think and Act Differently BHP, but equally my supervisors in Carl Spandler, Anita Pabaka-Fox and Laura Jackson have been excellent mentors in the process. So the way I wanted to set the scene was to begin with the idea, or the fact, that humans are forces of nature, and we have been for a long time. You know, mining activities are shifting more material around the planet than nature is via geological forces. And this is quantified. We can quantify this. We're pouring mine waste deposits at a rate of 100 billion tonnes per year. And as stress supply is servicing exponential appetite for critical minerals, copper alone, and we are the copper state, copper alone is pegged to be producing 800 billion tonnes of waste rock and tailings by 2050. This is absolutely staggering. And as geologists, we're often really good at understanding how rocks are made, sometimes, but we're often less interested in what we're making of rocks. And so what this research has been is an exploration into how we can begin to characterise, how we can begin to understand the very unique mineral systems we're creating, particularly in our mine tailings deposits. And the case study for this was Prominent Hill. It's our own backyard. So let's get into it. What came out of this, like I said, is essentially the beginnings of a blueprint for a characterisation process of what it's nice to call the anthropogenic mineral systems in mine tailings. These mine tailings deposits, on the highest possible level, are created by trackable geological and mining inputs. You know, we talk about the critical minerals in the TSF, the tailings storage facility. They have origins in the Mesoproterozoic, but the tailings deposit itself is much more akin to a sedimentary-style deposit formed over 13 years of man-made inputs. So the way that we embarked on this characterisation journey of mine tailings is we actually drowned in data a little bit. We collated and synthesised a series of material flow data sets, and I'll flesh out that concept in just a sec. But for now, what you need to know is we synthesised a bunch of pretty isolated site data, the geo team, the MET team, the tailings team, etc. Then we sampled the stuff. We have 4 drill holes that spanned quite a distance across the radius of the TSF, and then we zoomed in. We got microanalytical. We looked at the geochemistry, the mineralogy, and the mineral chemistries of some of the copper sulfides and the rare earth minerals. I won't get to the rare earth minerals today. This is a cooler story. Righto, so let's get into Prominent Hill's material flow processes, because these are the processes that, on the high level, totally constrain what the tailings deposit looks like. Prominent Hill, hematite IOCG. Worth mentioning that South Australian IOCGs have the highest known concentrations of rare earths of any IOCG deposits globally. So it's interesting to look at them in that different perspective. Then, over the last 13 years, via open pit mining, then into underground mining, Prominent Hill has taken out a series of hematized host rocks. We took out the copper and the gold. We'll get that to in a sec. The processing plant is a series of grinding and froth flotation circuits. Then we deposit it into that tailings storage facility by a very systematic process of deposition. So when I talk about material flow processes, what I'm talking about is how do you take a rock 1 kilometre underground, pop it in a stockpiling too, so that's an important step there, is actually the rocks get stockpiled and a bit muddled. So how do you take a Mesoproterozoic chunk of ore, pop it in a stockpile, pop it in a processing plant, and deposit it as slurried stone into what is actually an almost 2 kilometre wide facility? Well, that requires understanding material flow processes. So let's start at the beginning of the process of building the Prominent Hill tailings deposit. Let's do a little quick overview of the Prominent Hill geology, because this is the bulk composition of the tailings. The bulk composition of the waste tailings is the gangue mineralogy of the ore that we've been mining. Prominent Hill, we've got legends of Prominent Hill geology in the audience, so I'll go over this super quickly. Prominent Hill mines a series of deposit host rocks that exist on a spectrum of hematization. Basically, we're looking at hematite, hematite quartz, hematite sericite quartz. There are 3 or 4 different host rocks that can, if we very much simplify things, can exist on this spectrum. We've got some dolomite in there, etc., but really hematite, quartz, sericite, and variants of those 3 minerals form the bulk composition of our tailings deposit. And, you know, I mentioned stockpiling for a reason, and that's because what I'll get to in the end is identifiable trends in the downhole composition of the tailings dam. However, it is actually quite an imprecise process to try and track the geology of what you mine out of the ground at a moment in time, understand what stockpile it went into, and understand when it's processed when. That's imprecise and that's difficult. Nonetheless, we actually see patterns in the downhole compositional data of the tailings anyway. So that's my preface there. Let's chat about the sedimentary-style deposition of the tailings dam. So like I said, it's analogous to a man-made sedimentary deposit with what is very old geological material. You can see on the left-hand side, that is your left, right? That's far side. On your far side, you can see a bird's eye view of the tailings dam. Like I said, it's about 1.8 kilometres wide. It's about 24 metres deep, confirmed by drilling data. And those circles that you see on the outer margin, they're called spigots, or depositional points. That's where tailings, the slurried stone, that processing waste, that's where it comes out. That changes every 3 days. So if you think about it, you start at one spigot and every 3 days you move to another one and tailings flows out quite systematically across the dam. It takes about 75 days to build a complete tailings horizon. So call it what, 5 rotations in a year to build. That's how many sort of horizons you'll build up in a year. In theory, this is quite systematic. This is why Prominent Hill has been a fantastic case study, because these processes, they've been quite simplified. That's quite a lovely, simple story of deposition over time. I've got some pickies because the tailings dam is quite a strange outlook, really. There's a mixture of mud cracking, secondary precipitates. It's quite the interesting scape. You can see fresh tailings coming out, covering those mud cracks. It's a fascinating outlook. Brilliant. So this deposition can be quantified. In fact, we did quantify it, and we did it on an annual basis. Now, tables are boring on a slide, so instead what I've done is simplified it for you. It's to illustrate the kind of data that we compiled, the material flow data that we compiled. It's averaging about 8 million tonnes of tailings volume into the TSF per year to build a total volume of 112 million tonnes in the Prominent Hill TSF. Now, think about this like a sedimentary geo, which I'm not, but whatever, we'll ignore that. If you think about it like a sedimentary geo, you can start to build an idea of the sediment load into the TSF, the tailings sediment load into the TSF. So we're assuming a lateral continuity of tailings. I just said that deposition builds really nice horizons over time. So assuming that lateral continuity of tailings, and I know how much tailings went into that TSF, we can actually begin to quantify the stratigraphy of that tailings dam. So, you know, that's the picture up there it's a schematic, but the lines aren't these lines are arbitrary, but I really want you to keep in your mind that as we talk about the stratigraphy of the tailings, it's quantified because we've managed to synthesize production data, tailings volume data, etc. So the stratigraphy, we can start to build a stratigraphic model of the tailings. Now, this is just in case anyone's sitting there going, oh, that's a bold assumption to think that it's quite laterally continuous. This is backed up by the compositional data that we found downhole. So I've got, let's see, sericite, quartz and hematite. Like I said, not a surprise, that's the gang of the host rock. And each individual dot is one of those boreholes. So you can see downhole, you can see each borehole. And there's not much variance between those. This is, to put this in perspective, the distance between those boreholes, from borehole 1 to borehole 4, was about 850 metres. It's about the radius of the dam. That's massive. And the variance is just not there. So we're beginning to understand the homogeneity of the dam is a really cool feature for us to build models with. And you know what, I'll actually go back. You see that dolomite spike there? This is for any sort of miners in the audience. Some of Prominent Hill's first introduction to underground mining was dolomite. So some of the first rocks that we pulled out of those open stopes were dolomite rocks, and it's cool that tailings is an ultimate archive of what you're processing when. It's an absolute archive. Righto, I want you to ignore that left-hand rainbow for a second. And it's time to smash all of these ideas together. What this figure asks you to do is imagine that for every tailings strata, for every horizon in that tailings dam, there is a production year at Prominent Hill Mine which is responsible for its composition. Right? So for every horizon of that tailings dam, if you had a perfect world of data, you can understand its composition as a function of what was processed during that production year. And what we begin to see, we've got gold, we've got rare earth elements, which average about 0.33% downhole. We then go to hematite quartz, which is that light green, which I use as a bit of a mineralogy metric. And I can debate with the Prom Hill Geos how effective that is. But it's to say when the hematite quartz is high, we're probably in more hematite-rich host rocks. And when hematite quartz is low, we're probably in that quartzy, sericite range. And then we've got copper to sulfur, which I gathered from float feed data. So the copper to sulfur grade of what was entering the float feed. And we can actually see that gold, rare earth elements, hematite quartz, they're playing together. I'm not confident to explain why, because like I said, the geology becomes imprecise. But what this proof of concept begins to let you think about is that there are trends, compositional trends, geological trends in that tailings dam that align with stratigraphy. And now I bring in that left-hand side, where I say there is provenance. There is a host rock provenance to the tailings sediments. This is a proof of concept, because ideally, what that left-hand side would have is the type of host rock. You know how I said hematite, quartz, sericite? Ideally, the categories of what ore went into the processing plant, which is what that graph is, would be related to the geology of the ore deposit. However, this is a mine site that teams operate separately, unfortunately. So instead what that data set is open pit, underground, copper or gold. It's a good example though of, as we continue building these behemoth tailings deposits, how can site teams work together so that we actually have a cohesive picture of what the tailings are. So just to sum that up, what we can begin to do is talk about the geochronology of the tailings sediments as a function of production year, and we can talk about the composition of those tailings sediments as a function of the host rock that went in. A little imprecise, but hopefully there can be some work there. Now, to round it out, what I would love to point out is that in that interval of 2014 to 2019, according to this data set, so maybe someone on site knew, but according to this data set, we weren't processing gold. We weren't popping rocks in for the purposes of getting gold out. And yet if you look at that downhole gold, what's actually happening at those associated intervals in the tailings dam is the gold concentrations are going up. Now, my understanding of gold at Prominent Hill is that we mine the stuff that occurs as free gold in hematite breccia matrices. The gold in the tailings dam, when we zoom in, is actually stacked in the sulfides. So again, how can we begin to have conversations, speak the same language with each other on site so that we actually understand the resource potential of the tailings dam in a way that doesn't require an honest student to unify more than seven different data sets, right? And this is awesome, and I'm not going to have much time to talk about it. But this is to say that if we think about the economic potential of the Prominent Hill tailings deposit, it's fundamentally not the same ore that it was before. No oxides, no chlorides, no sulfates in the Prominent Hill ore body. Nothing but oxides, chlorides and sulfates in the Prominent Hill sulfides in the tailings dam. So we can begin to see that the anthropogenic mineral system of the Prominent Hill tailings deposit can be thought of on a high level by synthesising mining and geological data sets, the stratigraphy, but it also requires this detailed microanalytical characterisation of what is happening on the surface, what are the man-made artefacts that we're imprinting onto our sulfides, that we absolutely will need to know if we ever want to reprocess this stuff. It requires looking at it at the micro and the macro. Ideally, into the future, I'll shoot myself in the foot by saying this, ideally our mines don't create tailings. I would love to see a world where we're not leaving any imprint in the Anthropocene rock record at all. But if I bring back to my perspective as a geologist, I would say that we're all very, very empowered to actually understand our man-made deposits using geoscience perspectives. And actually that's going to be really, really important as this conversation of tailings reprocessing, repurposing only accelerates into the future. The geologist has to come to the table if we want to do this with any degree of success. Thank you for having me.